I wanted to raise a discussion point which came up during Francois Del's talk as kind of a throwaway remark, but I think is very much in the spirit of exactly what's behind much of Morris's work and how he's guided many people to think. And that was when Francois said, perhaps in the study of metrics, there's still not complete agreement on what are the right questions to be asking. Maybe you can paraphrase, maybe I'm paraphrasing, maybe that was how you said it, but perhaps you could say a bit more to inspire just a couple of minutes of discussion about this notion of formulating questions before necessarily running, as in the great story of 42, right? Finding the number 42 in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but not knowing what the question was yet. And perhaps that's where you were going with your reaction to some of the papers.
Yes, at one point I pointed out a distinction between two questions, and there was question A and question B, and I said that already a lot of work had been done on the question A, let's say, which was how is the optimal way to fill an empty grid with linguistic material, and that I thought I was interested in question B, which was how is it the optimal way to mimic a certain rhythmic pattern using linguistic material. And it seemed to me that the question I was interested in was the most direct question you should attack head-on. But this being said, the other question, which had been worked on by Bruce Hayes and also by John and Laerdal, the work they had done on it was probably a long way towards the question I was interested in. But yeah, it seems to me text setting is really in the infancy. Very little work has been done, and we are a bit like we maybe in some areas of linguistics we were 50 years ago, and so as I remember, in linguistics proper, the revolution, a lot of the really big change was just to ask the right questions. I mean, to direct people's gaze towards certain questions and not the questions, let's say, that I had been taught to look at when I was a student, licence student in Paris, okay? And it seems to me, in text setting, we know so little, we can still wonder about what it is really that we want to attack as a research problem. I don't know, it's very,
The other points that occurred to me that perhaps someone might like to comment on, I was thinking during Christine Hanson's talk about the irregularity of ternarity, and of course she presented an interesting way in which anapests had found their way into English verse through this interesting historical route, but of course very little comment was made, and it's, to my mind, I don't know how often dactyls come up, and dactyls seem to be even rarer than anapests, right? And in a way this sort of parallels perhaps the fact that iambs are a preferred meter to trochees, and this seems to be something which relates to the syntax of English, right? It seems to be that maybe this is because English has weak determiners, a book, to love, etc. And so I wonder if anyone here wants to comment on how the distribution of function words and sort of the syntax of English might guide preference for one meter over the other when otherwise the choice seems to be rather symmetric.
It looks like both trochaic and dactylic verse in English are simply hard to compose. There's two notorious cases from Longfellow where he wrote the Song of Hiawatha, and people thought and still think that it sounds very funny. There's something very wrong with it. He perhaps might have done even worse in composing Evangeline. This is the forest primeval, the murmuring pines and the hemlocks, which is perhaps even more awkward. The last observation that I can offer is that there are occasional trochaic meter folk songs in English, and they have an interesting property. They often go on for several stanzas being trochaic, and then finally the folk poet just can't stand it anymore and writes a line with an initial stressless syllable. So this brings up something that Paul Koparski has mentioned, and Kristen in their paper on universal metrics, that there seems to be a requirement that the metrical system make it possible to conveniently compose poetry or song in it. And I think this is almost part of traditional wisdom, that there's something very un-English about trying to write trochees or dactyls.
Yeah, but I'd like to, given the array of dactylic words in English compared to anapestic words, it would seem easier to compose, right? But the intuition might be that it's simply too cloying if you were to fit all of these. I mean, English, right? We know there are 90% trochees in English compared to iambs. Even the very word iambic should be pronounced iambs instead of iambs to be true to form. But, you know, so
but Andrew,
it would seem to be too
syntax.
cloying. Perhaps.
It's the syntax. You have to write lines consisting of, sentences or phrases. And that's where you get into a collision with English grammar, which so characteristically causes the sentence to begin with some kind of stressless proclitic. I think that's where the poets are suffering when they try to write trochees.
Yeah, but there's a purely musical story to be told too, right? Because what forget about the words, say, in your folk songs. If you're talking about a trochaic form, you're talking about you're talking about a tune without an anacrusis. Yeah, right? You're talking about something that has an anacrusis, okay? Now the question is there any reason why you wouldn't want to have that just as a purely musical form? And in fact, there is, when you think about it, right? Because what's going to happen is you want something that's going to be able to mark your beginning. You're not going to want to have a phrase ending, right? For your first anything that's going to mark a phrase ending. But one of the characteristics of a downbeat is that notes that are heard on the downbeat are heard as phrase endings. So if you start on your initial position with a downbeat, you're going to put a group boundary on the right side of it. So it's like you're going to stop the tune before the tune starts. Okay? So this has nothing to do with whatever syllable inhabits that position. It's just a purely formal characteristic of the rhythmic structure of music that might explain the bias against trochees. I mean, I haven't worked that out, but that's an idea.
Another comment about part of your question, which reminded me of work by Hisao Tokizaki on the distribution of head direction and where stress tends to go in the word in different languages. And it turns out that there are statistically significant correlations, that languages that tend to have final stress tend to be head initial, and languages that tend to have word initial stress tend to be head final. There are many, many counterexamples, but there turns out to be a correlation, which is I think, of interest to anybody who wants to study the relation between the syntax and the phonology in that regard.
I think I want to make a comment which is in a way directed to John Halle, but let me just say first about the point Bruce just made. That phenomenon of seeing poets trying to write trochaic verses and then kind of giving up and switching to iambs a little bit partway through is something which relates to one of the classic problems in English metrics, which is this difference between iambs and trochees. If you assume you can have final extra metricality in an iambic meter and initial catalexis, and you can have final catalexis in a trochaic meter and initial anacrusis in a trochaic meter, how do you tell the difference between the two? And in generative metrics, the idea that that's an easy thing to answer based on the distribution of constituency is, I think, settled that. But there is an ancillary fact that I think the idea that you can have anacrusis in trochaic meter is something that only arises when it is a text set to music. So there's actually a little analogous history about that. So I think the case that Bruce describes arises in songwriting and not actually in written poetry. And the reason I mentioned that as a preface to John's question is I think he was suggesting that there was a really crucial question about the role of unoccupied positions that distinguishes music, for which he said it's just it's essential to have that possibility to have music. And that's something which is highly restricted in meter. It's something which only exists as an edge phenomenon. Catalexis is, at least as far as I know, something whose possibility is conditioned by presence at a boundary. And I wondered, since you had made a to-do about the absence of constituency in the musical structure, whether you regarded those things as related in any way, if you see what I mean.
Okay, help me. I have to think this through. Okay, so what you're saying is, so in meter you get unoccupied, you get catalexis, but you never get them lined internally.
Well, actually, you
Rarely.
Yeah. So a common example is, of course, line initially. So
Yeah.
Capulet finds Juliet and says,
Well, 20 Bookus clad and
"That's
that,
right.
Okay,
Exactly.
there's one.
You do also get them medially, but you get them, say, at colon boundaries.
Yeah.
That are, so
Which is close to the line boundary.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah.
Exactly.
Well,
So
I mean, there's
conceptually the same.
right. I mean, there's an easy story from my perspective, which, maybe not right, but so the deal is that long notes give you grouping boundaries. Grown events give you group boundaries. End of right. So anytime you have an unoccupied position, the event which precedes it is going to be a grouping boundary. Right? So what that means, so what you're going to get for free, therefore, is at the end of the line, you're going to get a group, and what the metricists, the prosodists call a line, you get a grouping boundary. If you have a catalectic position line medially, you're going to get it exactly where you say it is, at the caesura, okay? At the beginning, it's not going to matter, because you're not going to have a long, or it will only apply to the end of the previous line, right? The distance of time between the last syllable of your previous line and the initial syllable of your subsequent line. So in either case, you're going to get a gap, and when you get a gap, you get a grouping boundary, and you want that grouping boundary to align with a syntactic constituent, or you get these weird mismatch phenomena, right? I mean, one example? I mean, so there are nice examples you can give of that. So take the song Hernando's Hideaway, yeah? Okay, so you can go, whose woods these are, I think I know, right? Nope, Jay Kaiser taught me this, so that's right. Okay, you can do that, no problem, right? But now, right, no, but, right, no, wait, okay? So the curfew tolls the knell of parting is wrong, right? Well, why is it wrong? Okay, because because the constituent overlaps the grouping boundary. The syntactic, metrical constituent overlaps, doesn't align with the grouping boundary, so it sounds weird. But no, and it can't be stressed, right? Because both of them are iambic. Okay, so you want the constituents to match up, and the catalectic positions give you the grouping boundary, which allows you the constituents to align. Does that make any sense?
Doc has asked me on behalf of the department to thank all of you for coming. I think it's been a wonderful event. So let's first of all thank ourselves. And then you know who I'm going to thank next. Let's thank Morris for being Morris. See you at dinner. Thank you.